Today's guest is one of the pioneers of Great Lakes steelhead fly fishing. He's chased steelhead across nearly every state, Canada, and Russia, and is known for his soulful voice of fly fishing literature. In this episode, you'll hear some incredible fly fishing history, amazing stories, and surprising lessons that will leave you inspired on your fly fishing journey this year. This is the Wet Fly Swing podcast, where I show you the best places to travel to for fly fishing, how to find the best resources and tools to prepare for that big trip, and what you can do to give back to the fish species we all love. Jerry Kustich, Sweetgrass Fly Rods owner and fly fishing innovator, is going to take us on a vast journey of his knowledge of the history of fly fishing and how it all started with this cabin he built, this off-the-grid cabin he built out west in Idaho. And it all started there, and how he's worked around to connecting and working with Tom Morgan at Winston Rod Companies, how he turned that into Sweetgrass, the bamboo and fly fishing renaissance movement. So much good stuff here today. I'm just going to get right into it. So without further ado, here he is, Jerry Kustich. You can see him at sweetgrassrods.com. How you doing, Jerry?
Real good. How are you, Dave?
Good. Yeah, it's great to have you on here. We've had your brother on, Rick, a number of times here. He's got a bunch of stuff going on. I've fished with Rick too, which has also been amazing. We did a trip out.
That. Wow.
Yeah, we did a trip out to we called it our Steelhead School, and we did a trip with Jeff Liskay and Rick was out in our New York, and it was awesome. It was really cool. We had a good crew out there. So, but we haven't really touched base with you. I've heard a lot about you, Sweetgrass Rods. Your books that you have going. You've been called some pretty amazing things. The soulful voice of of fly fishing literature. I've heard some things out there, but we're also going to just talk about just in general what you have going. So first off, give us an update. What's going on this time of year with you? It's I guess we're almost into April. Are you fishing this time of year or more hanging low?
Yeah, I'm starting to. I'm not as aggressive at fishing as I used to be. I'm pushing 79, but I just was out last night on my kayak. That's primarily what I do, is fish out of my kayak now. And I was on the Susquehanna River looking for some striped bass, which have become more of a mythical fish these days. Have gone down considerably. At least it's not like they're gone, but if you have a boat where you can travel and chase them long distances, it's one thing. But the places that I usually find fish, I'm just not finding as many anymore. So it's been kind of frustrating that way.
Gotcha. Yes. Okay. So that's something maybe we'll talk more about, as we get into it. But let's take it back, because we've heard Rick's intro story to fly fishing. I'd love to hear yours. So do you have a first memory of fly fishing? Have you been doing this a while?
Yeah. It's one of those things I write about. In the early 70s, I don't know. I don't want to get too much in the weeds here.
Yeah, go for it.
But I was in the seminary for 8 years, and I left the seminary. I was teaching school in Utah and left in 1972. I was going to continue to teach and get my master's degree. And at one point, I just decided, I was sitting in class and I said, I've had enough education, I guess, that I just kind of wanted to just go off and look, and discover what's out there. So at that time, it was in 1975. And I had been reading Joe Brooks's book, Trout Fishing. And it just captured my imagination. He was traveling all over the world at the time. It was unique because fly fishing travel wasn't that common back then. And I saw a picture of a Dolly Varden, which is now a bull trout in char, and hanging on a log. And I think it must have been the Flathead River, and I just wanted to go and catch one. So I that was my quest. I hopped in the car, or in my pickup. I packed up everything I owned and was living out of my truck looking for a Dolly Varden.
Wow.
And one road led to another. I went through Montana, and I was kind of a hippie-looking guy at the time. And Montana wasn't too much, I don't think, into hippies then, and they kept sent me down the road, and essentially to northern Idaho, which was where the hippies were. And
right.
I met a guy who was a minister I met him in a corner restaurant in Priest River, Idaho, which was ironic since I was studying to be a priest. And he said, I know a guy who could probably get you into a Dolly Varden. So he took me way back up into the backwoods. And I met this guy, John Landon, his name was. And he was an artist. His wife was an artist, and they built somewhat of an artist type of house in the middle of nowhere. And he took me out fishing up into what turned out to be illegal water. It was closed, but I did catch a Dolly Varden. I didn't catch him, though, on a fly at that time. I was in fly fishing, but I knew this is a place I wanted to be. And as it turned out, John was from Buffalo, New York, which is where I was from. And then I found out, I told that story to my parents. When I was telling them on the phone, they became very quiet. And then they asked me, why did I end up in Priest River? And I just told them. And they said I had an uncle who in 1993 had died in Priest River, Idaho.
Wow.
He was working for the Conservation Corps, the CCCs at the time. So I kind of felt that was probably where I was meant to be. So I ended up buying a piece of land, building a cabin, living off grid, and within that same time frame started to fly fish, and met someone who knew someone and how to tie flies. At the time, there wasn't, other than Joe Brooks's book, there wasn't much written about how to fly fish, where to go to fly fish.
What year was that, Jerry, when you
That
started?
was I built the cabin in 1976.
76. Okay.
And from there, I ended up getting a job. So I lived in the cabin in the wintertime off grid. And then I got a job with Forest Service in central Idaho on the Laxaw River, just about 60 miles from Montana. And so it was just perfect. I was able to fly fish the Laxaw after work every night. And on the weekends, every weekend, I'd head to Montana and fish someplace different. And it was seat of your pants fishing. I just learned one cast at a time. I mean, there was no shortcuts to learning. It was just kind of like you just had to do it. Unlike nowadays where you can pick up any of this information easily. So it was fun, but that's a thing. And at that time, then my brother figured into it. He's 15 years younger, and he used to come out and visit me for a week or two, and we'd traipse around Montana primarily, and then go up and stay in my cabin as well. So, and he at the time was, I think, thinking about coming out to moving maybe to Montana. But at that same time, the Great Lakes, we grew up on the Niagara River. And at the same time, the Great Lakes were coming back strong. And he was probably one of the few people, there wasn't a lot of people fishing that magnificent fisheries in the late 70s and early 80s. And he used to tell me over the phone these great fishing stories of these big fish. And he wasn't, at that time, he was fly fishing, but he wasn't thinking in terms of using a fly for the big fish. And we talked about it, and he started swinging big flies up there in Niagara, probably in the late 70s and the early 80s, and it never looked back. And from that, I was tempted to come back. It was so good, but so I was able to kind of do a little of both every year. I eventually moved out of Idaho into Montana in 1983 and was able to fish all around Montana, and then hop in the car and spend 4, 5, 6 weeks in New York. And as I got more and more into working with fly rods and making fly rods, I'd do 2 short trips, 2 to 3 week trips a year to New York. So it's kind of an overlay of how all of this worked.
That's amazing. Yeah. So you basically had this West, exploration, right? You're out in the West. And I want to hear more about that too, about this cabin off the grid. And at the same time, it's really interesting because your brother, you guys are kind of picking up, it sounds like fly rods, although you're older, so you kind of picked up first, but doing your own thing on the East and the West Coast. Is that kind of how it worked? Then you're exchanging stories as you went?
Oh yeah, it was. I mean, and that was a neat thing. Although he was a little more in his younger year, he's sort of been able to travel a lot more, obviously, as he got older. But we'd pick up all these different stories and we'd, traipse after them, whether it was another river in the Great Lakes or another place out west. And it just kept on doing different things. That was the thing. And it was more inspired. All of this for me was more inspired. It wasn't a matter of, I always examine it. It wasn't a matter of the catching of the fish. It was looking for the fish and these journeys that would take me to different places. And because I was inspired by Joe Brooks, Joe, that's what at least that's what his book indicates, is that he just, loved going to these different places and catching different species in different situations.
Right.
And Rick shares that same gene, I guess.
Yeah.
And between us, we've covered a lot of water.
Were your parents into like outdoors angling or any of that stuff?
Not at all. My dad, he'd go fishing. I've written about it. My uncle and my mother's father, so my grandfather, they fished regularly. And but my dad would go. He wouldn't go on his own, and he would go fishing if someone asked him. But if he had something better to do, he wouldn't go.
He didn't do it. Was your grandfather fishing in? Was he like conventional or fly fishing?
Oh no, just conventional.
Yeah, out in the east, out in New York.
Yeah, we lived just about probably a quarter mile from the Niagara River. Unfortunately, when the Niagara was pretty polluted, but there was still fish around, but it was pretty crappy. A lot of the stink and all of that, a dead fish.
Oh, right.
But he'd sit on an old cement dock and catch bullheads and sheephead, freshwater drum, and some bass. He'd get some bass and some perch. There was still a smattering of different fish around.
Wow, this is great. And you mentioned a few on the book. And we've talked about that book quite a bit because that is a huge book. What is the big the first Steelhead book you guys did? You and Rick did?
It was I think we just called it Great Lakes Fly Fishing.
Yeah, Great Lakes Fly Fishing. Yeah.
Rick and I, at one point in all our discussions, I think it was in the early 90s, we recognized that this was a great resource. I was working at Winston Rods at the time.
Oh,
and then I think in 1991 is when I started building bamboo rods with Glenn Brackett there. And Rick and I realized there was just a great resource throughout the Great Lakes. We'd been talking to different people in the different states, and there was steelhead in every river at the time. And one of the places that had a better history of steelhead was Michigan, of course. And then there were remnant populations up in Lake Superior of fish that nothing was being stocked up in Lake Superior. And there were words coming from a lot of the North Shore rivers that there were still steelhead up there. They were smaller fish, but they were linked to fish that were planted way back in the late 1800s. So we embarked upon a several-year mission to explore as many rivers as we could possibly explore around the Great Lakes. And our intention was to catch a steelhead out of every river in the Great Lakes, but that never came to fruition because there were so many lakes or so many rivers. But on the other hand, we explored a whole lot of them. I think we probably caught fish out of about 75 of them, which was pretty.
Wow. 75 out. How many are there, or how many were there then?
Oh, that was a good question. I don't know if I ever come up with the exact number.
Like the bigger ones, right?
There's probably at least a couple hundred river streams that carried steelhead. And so I was charged with doing the western part of the lakes. And so at least 3 or 4 times I did the Lake Superior to North Shore, and I stopped at different rivers. I hooked up with a couple different guides every now and then, and not knowing really what we were doing at the time. That was the thing. We were not only exploring rivers, we were developing techniques to catch these fish.
Right, with the fly. This was with the fly?
Yes, and at the time, in the mid 80s, I had started steelhead fishing on the West Coast, and especially in Idaho, the Salmon River, and was swinging flies back then. But we were told that you really can't swing flies in Montana or in the Great Lakes to catch a fish. In fact, they're never. A lot of guys said you're never going to catch a fish on a fly in the Great Lakes. tributaries, and so we were fighting a lot of just local lore that it wasn't possible. And so, but we kind of, we're nymph fishing for them. We didn't really think in terms because the water was a little confining on a lot of the rivers, that we were just fishing and just nymphing techniques, and we were starting to catch some fish, and said, baloney, you can catch fish on a fly.
Were you that early nymphing? Were you guys doing like eggs or
Yeah,
stonefly?
eggs, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then there was just a variety of glow bugs and as eggs and little flashy little things. And yeah, it was, and so that was the original technique. And we were essentially, I'll have to say, we were defying the odds because not many people were doing any of that. In fact, I don't think anybody was doing it.
What year is this now? 80s?
This would have been the early 90s.
Early 90s, yeah. So early 90s Great Lakes, yeah. There's not many people out there swinging flies or even doing any fly fishing for steelhead.
No, not at all. Yeah, and then it just gradually progressed. So I'd do some North Shore rivers, and I'd stop at St. Mary's River, and then I'd go and hook up with Rick, and we'd hop in the truck and go. So I would go to Western New York, which he was covering pretty good, and then he was covering the rivers up in Ontario that went into both Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, from Grand River, the Maitland River, Saugeen River, and he was doing all of those. And then I'd hop in the truck when I'd get out there and do a lot of that with him as well. And then we'd go back to Michigan and we'd fish the Manastees and the White River and Pere Marquette and Ausable. And, so it just, we spent probably 6 or 7 years just purposely doing research.
San Juan Rodworks started with a simple belief: great fly rods and gear shouldn't cost a fortune. As a family-run company, they focus on building high-quality fly fishing products that perform on the water without the premium price tag. You can try San Juan Rodworks for 30 days, risk-free right now, and if you're not satisfied, send it back for a full refund. You can go to sanjuanrodworks.com. That's SANJUAN rodworks.com. Fish the Fly Guide Service is dedicated to sharing the incredible fly fishing opportunities around Jackson Hole. Whether floating the scenic Snake River in search of native cutthroat trout or hiking into the mountains to explore pristine tributaries, every day on the water is an adventure. You can join them for an unforgettable fly fishing experience in the heart of the Tetons at fishthefly.com. And what were you doing? How were you making your money back then?
Well, I was, the best thing of this whole thing is when I joined up with Winston Rods in 1984. They, Tom, when I say they, it was Tom Morgan who owned it.
Yeah.
Glenn Brackett was co-owner. And they were excited because they were expanding their workforce. They didn't have many people working for them at the time. And they were excited to hire someone who was passionate about fly fishing. So that was one of the requirements. Is they said, we really would like you to do, to fly fish.
Oh, really? That was it. That was part of the job.
Yeah, get out there and do stuff and kind of lend some credibility to all of this stuff. And so for several years, all I really did was wrapped rods at home, and they'd give me rods to wrap and the guides on, and then I'd wrap. So I had all of this latitude. I could wrap rods till 2 a.m, which I did. So I would have the day to fish. And eventually they moved me in, and I do part-time work in the morning. Not part-time. I was sort of managing the area, the coating area, or coated the wraps. And but then in the afternoon, and I was free to go fishing and still wrap rods at 2 a.m. And so I wasn't sleeping a whole lot back then. But it worked out really nice. And then when Glenn got me into building bamboo rods in 1991, he encouraged me to do, this tremendous flexibility in my schedule. And he enjoyed the fact that I was writing a book. And, so I give Glenn all the credit in the world for encouraging this sort of passion. Yeah,
That's really cool.
Yeah, and it worked out really well, I thought.
This makes a lot of sense. So you've got, and I'm looking at the book now. It's Fly Fishing for Great Lakes Steelhead: An Advanced Look at an Emerging Fishery. That was the first one, because I think Rick came in and did another book called Advanced, or there was another book out. I think Rick's done a few, right?
Yeah, I forget. Yeah, he did it on his own. Of course, yeah, I sort of, as I faded more and yeah, because I got more into, well, owning my own business. He kind of went off a little more on his own and updated. That was that his advice.
Oh, that was the updated, right? So that was
Yeah.
So we're looking. So there is original
It
one.
was
Yeah.
kind of not the same, but it was updated as far as the techniques and all of that kind of.
Yeah, all that stuff. Right. No, this is interesting. So basically, you're out there. When we've heard this from a few people, I mean, I always go back to John Gierach because he, said this on the podcast when I talked to him a few times about why he, got into fly fishing and why he did what he did. And he said it was mainly because his dad loved fishing, but he never had time because he was working all the time. And so he wanted to create a life where he was out there. And it sounds like you also had created that life, right? You figured out a way to fish all the time.
It was, and I think I came about at a time, John Garrett, the ultimate trout bum. I was independently doing the same trout bumming thing
At the same time. Yeah, really at the same time.
Yeah. So, in fact, I'm just reading a little manuscript of a friend who wrote his experiences with John Garrett during that period of time. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah. So it's a nice little manuscript.
Gotcha. So you're reading somebody's manuscript that they're hoping to publish after you give them some feedback.
Yeah, a friend of Dale Darling, actually, his name is, and Dale used to own a couple fly shops in Colorado, one in Longmont, and I met him through Winston.
Yeah, this is interesting. I love all this because it sounds, the more I love these conversations, because the more we talk, you've been around for so long, you've got all these stories, and one of them is like the Winston. And I was just doing a podcast with someone who was describing the fact that he was talking about bower reels, and he didn't know a lot about Winston, even though he worked for him, the history. But do you know a little bit? Can you shed some light on that history? I know I've heard Glenn Brackett's name quite a bit. Were you there when Winston first kind of got going, or did you jump on early on?
No, let's see. Winston started in 1929.
Oh, wow. Yeah, Winston's been around forever. That's right.
Yeah, and Lou Stoner and a guy named Robert Winther were the original owners, and Stoner eventually bought Winther out, but the name Winston came from a contraction of their names, Winther, Winston, and Lou owned and ran the company until the 50s. He sold his share to Doug Merrick, and they worked together, and Stoner eventually passed and Merrick took over, and then Merrick sold the company to Tom Morgan, who Tom was a native Montana, and he used to guide out of Ennis when he was a kid, and went to California and chased a few things down there, and apparently met Merrick at a certain point and thought he'd like to bring Winston up to Montana because it was, that was the place to be, not in San Francisco, which that's where it was. And
right.
So Tom brought it up, and Tom had this impeccable knowledge of fly rods at the time. I mean, and what a fly rod should be. And it was at the time that he bought the company in like 1970, early 70s. And it was a time when composite graphite was starting to come around, but it was right in the height of fiberglass. And so Tom had all these ideas what a good fly rod should be from his years of guiding. And at the time, Glenn was working with them and during the transitional period, and Glenn then, from what I understand, got 25% of the company through sweat equity, and in the early 70s, and then when they moved it up to Montana and little Twin Bridges, Montana, just a town of 400 people, it just worked out real well, and that's I ended up in Twin Bridges like in 1983 because I wanted to fish the Big Hole River and be near the Big Hole River. And so that's when I met Tom and Glenn. And then in 1991, Glenn and Tom sold the company to the present owner, who is David Ondaatje he's a Canadian from Toronto. and more of an absentee owner, though. I mean, which was a departure from the previous owners who were all hands-on owners.
And Tom Morgan, we've heard the stories on him. I mean, he's well known about, just that whatever he had. And then he eventually got into his own company right after he sold, or he kept making rods, and that became a pretty famous story as well. But basically, essentially, you're in there with Tom Morgan, one of the greatest, I think, when people think about that, right? Bought rod building. And so you learned quite a bit. And then, so talk about the Sweetgrass. Where does that come to be, where you're involved in that?
During the 90s, the bamboo craze grew after the movie A River Runs Through It. It's amazing that river, that movie, the impact it had on.
Oh, it's huge. Yeah.
And so bamboo enthusiasm grew from that point, because in the early 70s, bamboo sort of was not only a dying craft, the interest was dying on it.
Yeah, there was nobody, because you had these fiberglass period, which were great. And then you got into graphite, and it just got like everything. I remember, because then why would you need a bamboo rod, right? You had these great graphite rods.
And that was it completely. And so the movie, just from a romantic standpoint, I'd say, just re-stimulated an interest in the past, and bamboo was a beneficiary of that. And so we at Winston started to make a lot of rods for that period anyway. And we still maintained a real flexible lifestyle. There was no question about it, because a lot of bamboo rod making is hurry up and wait. You do something, you glue, and you have to wait on it. So the thing was, Glenn was living in town. So there was always someone at the shop working at some time, because there was always something to do. But you didn't have to do it 9 to 5. You could do it 8 o'clock in the evening till midnight or whatever. So it just was that type of operation, and it worked out good again for me. And it worked out good for Glenn, but somewhere in the early 2000s that we were getting, Winston had built a big factory outside of town, just on the outskirts, not outside of town. It's just in a cow pasture outside of town. And there was rumblings that they wanted the bamboo department to come into the big building. And that because when they set up that factory, they also set up a time clock. You punched a card and going in, and you punched.
Oh, wow. So you had a time clock now.
Yeah.
So you're going from this hippie river bum, trout bum sort of thing back in the day, and now you're coming in there like, hey, we're going to be clocking in now and doing all this stuff.
That was their intention. It wasn't ours. So we resisted, and just said, you can't build a bamboo rod on a time clock, is what it boiled down to. And, it just has to kind of come from the soul, come from the heart. And as long as they're getting done and out into people's hands, what's the point? So, and it just sort of went downhill from there, and Glenn at one point had enough of it. He said, I'm just going to move on, and that was like in 2005, late 2005, he decided to call it quits. Well, I was steelhead fishing in Montana at the time, or in New York at the time. And I got a call from Glenn and said, I just quit. And I was beyond flabbergasted. I was pissed.
Right. You were surprised. You weren't expecting that.
Oh no. And I was, and I even talked to at the time, the CEO of the company, and I just chewed him out. I said,
oh, really? So yeah, you heard what happened, then you have to call with him.
Oh man, I chewed him out. Well, anyway, so at that point, there was another fellow working, Jeff Walker, who'd been working with Glenn for 20 years. And myself, and then there was another fellow, Wayne Maka, who would help out upon occasion when we needed extra help. And we decided to all quit in solidarity with Glenn. We just said, we're just going to go off and do our own thing. And so we did. And we gave Winston a 3-month period where we kind of cleaned up all of the odds and ends that needed to be cleaned up. And on February, at the end of February of 2006, our time at Winston was over. But at the time, we had no plans. There was no plans whatsoever. And Glenn started, as it turned out, there was this solidarity of people out in the fly fishing world who were somewhat flabbergasted with, with what just happened. And he started getting orders. At one point, he had over 100 orders on the books.
On bamboo rods?
On bamboo rods. They, if you ever get around to building them again, we want a rod from you. Well, Glenn approached the three of us, Wayne, Jeff, and myself, and said, I'm getting all these orders, and, we could set up a little business type of thing if you're interested. And Wayne wasn't. He was doing his own thing. Jeff was semi-interested, but he then, after a little, kind of just faded off. He didn't want to do it either. And I saw it as a wonderful opportunity. So we ended up doing it was shortly after leaving in 2006, we started the process. We kind of got a business license and all that by mid-April, we were officially Sweetgrass Rods. And we just decided to come up with Sweetgrass Rods because we didn't want to make it the Glenn Brackett Rod Company. Historically speaking, every company that was named after a primary...
Yeah, they all had names. All the rod companies he worked for had names of people.
Right. And the thing is, other than Winston, a lot of old bamboo companies just faded after the primary builder, Payne and Phillips, and all of those companies all ended up, once the primary builder was gone. Yeah, you could never kind of pass it on and be a viable company after that. So we decided that if our mission statement was to be Sweetgrass Rods, and to have a company that would be a legacy company, that after Glenn was gone, and I didn't consider myself that significant of a part at that point, other than just kind of being his partner. But after he was gone and I was gone, that the company could be passed on seamlessly and still operate as Sweetgrass Rods. And at this point, we are on track to do that. Glenn has a fellow, David Seraphin, who's working out in Livingston, Montana, and who is the heir apparent to the company. And hopefully that will be what will happen down the road.
Wow. Yeah. And now you are basically still affiliated but not connected at all to Sweetgrass?
The one major influence in my life that kind of changed the direction of my life was my wife, who, we lived together in Montana for 30 years, and she passed away. She had ALS, and she passed away in 2009. It was difficult living in a small town after she passed away. And so Sweetgrass started in 2006, and I stayed till 2013. And, I talked it over with Glenn, and I was training a fellow to take over for myself, and then I would leave. And the idea was, just to start kind of afresh somewhere else. I had met someone, and I had this wild hair up my butt to build a little place in Mexico and go fishing.
Oh, wow.
Mexico.
No kidding.
Yeah. So I ended up, from afar, had a little beach house built on the beach about 50 feet from a bonefish flats, and near Ixcalac, Mexico, just north of Belize. And so I went down there. We lasted about 10 months. It
didn't work out.
It was a little too much of a stretch.
What was just the challenge of like getting there, or was it?
Oh, just everything. Yeah. I mean, there was this little Mayan town, which is kind of a little funky little town that had been somewhat destroyed by a hurricane several years beforehand, and was limping along. And that was the main source of getting a few things. And then from there, the house was 5 miles up on the beach. So it was just a major, major effort. And I was pushing, my late 60s at the time.
Right. Things aren't getting any easier at that point.
No, it just, the fishing was great. And that was the one thing I was able to, in my dreams, I wanted to be a Jimmy Buffett. I wanted to have
Oh
my
yeah.
guitars and fish, live on the beach. And I did. So I can actually claim I did that for, almost a year and caught fish on my own. That's the other thing. I didn't want to have to go get a guide. So had bonefish that were accessible to me right in front of my house.
Oh
But
wow.
they were kind of like Spring Creek bonefish. I kind of got to know there was a pot of about 50 of them. And it just seemed like they'd seen a lot of flies over the years. So it was just sort of it was tough to get them, but it was fun. Trade, every couple days or every day I'd go out for a couple hours. And then there was a few sloughs, lagoons that had snook and baby tarpon and that were accessible by canoe, and I did that, and barracuda, and the only thing I did, I hooked every now and then. A permit came by. I did hook a permit. I was fortunately never got a permit down there, but I was able to get all those other fish and a few other.
What were you thinking at the time? Were you thinking kind of like you were going to be the like moving down there like full time?
Well, yeah, the idea was, we had a little guest house built next to it, next to our prime house there, and also a little what we thought would be possibly a t-shirt shop, something like that,
Yeah, sure.
sell flies and kind of just hang out. That was the original plan, but as it turned out, just the effort of just living there was and you didn't realize, you don't want to send a bad impression of the people, but you just you couldn't leave your house, without worrying about someone walking in and getting some.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And so there was that aspect of it. And then my partner, she got sick. And then you realize that, boy, if you get sick down here, it's not an easy thing to deal with, So, and
Yeah.
the closest places where you could get the groceries you needed was at 40 some miles away in a town called Mahawal. And Chetumal, we would go once a week, which was 120 miles away. And so it became evident that, just a lot of.
Yeah. How does that compare to when you think, because it sounds like it was just an amazing amount of work doing that. When you compare it back to the start of this episode, when you were talking about that cabin off the grid in Idaho, was that at the same age, say you're in your 20s, right? This probably would have been a lot easier, this thing.
Exactly. I mean, I think what I was trying to do was relive those days. That was the whole point. And those days, even living off grid way back then was difficult, but doable.
Yeah. But what about if you were in your 60s trying to do that Idaho thing off the grid?
Oh, that would have been tough. I mean, all that. Yeah, you're right. It's just, I think there was a point at which, and I got to say, some of it was just influenced by the fact that, I was kind of living a nice, good life without all the hassle,
Yeah.
And I didn't factor in all the hassles.
Yeah. You were, it's not taking it for granted, but we do that, right? You're someplace, I'm not sure where you are now, but you're at that place and it's probably a pretty good place because you got a lot of luxuries, right? And life is fairly easy. Is that kind of how it looked at the time that you didn't realize that?
Oh yeah. I mean, because we'd gone down there two or three times to that same area, and all you do is, stayed in a bed and breakfast, and it was just great. You had everything you needed, and, you just sort of didn't have to deal with the day-to-day life that you do when you're there.
When you're actually, you're down there all the time. And you mentioned, Lonnie Waller earlier too. He's a person that, I think it's interesting because I think he might have moved down south too, but he was a big steelhead guy. I remember watching his videos and his books and stuff, but talk about that back on the book there. So you guys worked with him on one of his books that he did?
Yeah. So the interesting thing with Lonnie was I still know him. I still know Jack Waller, his brother, who was this offbeat character who lived in Virginia City, Montana. Jack is this very philosophical, theological man of the earth type of guy. He lived in a teepee for a while.
Oh, wow.
And then, and so I knew Jack, and then I met Lonnie through Jack. And then there was this cross linking when we were researching that book. And I don't know how I can't remember the specifics of how we would have talked to Lonnie about steelheading, because at that point he was really into, the steelhead guru at that time. He was one of the more notable guys.
Yeah, he was working for, I think, like Scientific Anglers or something like that, doing those videos.
Yeah. And that was really put him on the map. Was he was doing videos before anybody ever thought of doing those types of things. And some of them were pretty spectacular. And so I think I utilized Jack's connection to talk to Lonnie, and Lonnie at the time was, he was always a real gracious guy. And somehow when the whole Great Lakes thing really started to flourish, he went out a few times to do some steelhead symposiums, and Rick met him at one of those symposiums. We approached him somewhat cautiously. We didn't know how he would accept our offer to write an introduction to Great Lakes steelhead, but he did. He graciously accepted it. So, and then subsequently, we published a book, which was a collection of stories, which was a neat collection of stories that Lonnie wrote, called River of Dreams. I think that was what it was. And it did real well. Yeah, it sold, 3,300 copies or something like that. So that was our connection. And I just got a email from Jack the other couple weeks ago. And a little story with Jack is he got married to a professor from Montana State University in Bozeman, and he had a little girl when he was 63.
Oh, wow.
And her name was Ruby, this cute little gal. And at the time, it was when my wife was kind of ill and, going downhill. And I've off and on played guitar and always in myself was writing songs. And I did write some songs, kind of goofy songs, but I wrote them. And I did write a song for Ruby, her name was. And we subsequently, a guy who was a music producer, actually, and he was from Virginia City, and he put together a neat little CD of local talent, and I did a couple songs on it, and one of them was. And so I just found out recently that you can dial up Ruby on Spotify or Apple Music or something.
Oh, you can get it right now.
Yeah, so I guess so. But anyway, the story is Ruby is now 20 years old, and it's sort of this genius little girl, now a young lady. And so it's just kind of this, there's this sort of like string of connections that all
that's amazing
are coming together. But
there it is, Ruby. I see it, Ruby on Spotify.
So
that's amazing.
Yeah, and she grew into the song. That was what was so funny. I always say she became the song, is what it boils down to.
We'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah.
Here's a little clip, Jerry. I'll just let it play. Is this it?
Falls down from the tree. But sometimes there can be a surprise.
Is that it?
That's it. Yep.
Amazing. There you go. Okay. Well, we've got that now in the show notes. We'll put a link to that. And,
yeah, pretty funny.
So this is good. So that's really cool. And so it's awesome because this goes back to Lonnie, which I remember, I've talked about this a little bit, but I remember one of those videos, he was on the Deschutes swinging and run that I've fished before and actually caught a really nice fish. And, what do you call it? Splasher in the tail. He had all these, he was super excitable, right? And he was out there. It was really cool. So that's the Lonnie connection. So he is down, I think didn't he move down south somewhere? It seems like he's not really in.
Yeah, he moved to a what we would say an expatriate enclave of sorts. A place where a lot of Americans and Canadians and Europeans. The idea behind that is that they could somewhat be a self-contained and even self-protected area, and it was fairly close to Mexico City, but I think the town was called San Miguel. I think it was a sort of an artist type of gathering.
Yeah. And what do you mean self-protected?
Well, they could, you kind of watched out for each other. You didn't have to worry about like we did, a house in the middle of nowhere in Mexico.
Oh, right. Gotcha.
He's subject to whatever.
Yeah, random stuff happening, right? Because you're talking Mexico, the drug cartels, right? There's even all that crazy stuff.
Yeah, all sorts of possibilities. And I want, again, the police weren't all that,
They weren't up to the law all the time, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so there were a lot of things you felt like you were at out flapping in the wind when you were in Mexico, and that was somewhat taken care of, because whether they had their own kind of little security system, I have no idea, but that was the idea of kind of having a bunch of like-minded individuals living in a general area. So yeah, and Lonnie, again, passed away in the fall, unfortunately.
Oh, he just passed away this last fall.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, you didn't? Yeah, unfortunately he did. And even more unfortunate, according to Jack, he developed dementia, so it was kind of
tough.
It was too bad. And I talked with Jack about it a bit, and it could have had something to do with he had that terrible plane crash going into the Babine somewhere. I forget when that was. I think it was after we hooked up with him. I can't remember the exact date. And he did, he suffered his head and, suffered great trauma. So it could have been all linked to that. But it was, a sad ending to a noble soul, I thought. It just really made me feel, kind of down in the dumps about that.
Yeah, that is pretty tragic.
Yeah. So especially a guy who was, so he was, he could have been, one of those snooty guys, but he wasn't. He just kind of, was ingratiating to everybody he met, and encouraging to everybody who needed encouragement. So I kind of will always remember Lonnie from that standpoint.
Yeah, no, I think I definitely, I think just the movies, I always go back to that, the videos, those were so powerful. But I mean, you've in your own right, written a number of books. Maybe talk about that a little bit, just on your writing. I mentioned at the start the kind of the soulful voice of fly fishing literature I've heard. But what is writing meant for you? Like, how do you look at writing? And are you still writing now?
Yeah, I am. Actually, I hope to come out with one last book at the end of this year. But the writing, I was kind of interested when I lived in my little cabin up in Idaho. I read a lot at that time. I read Louis L'Amour cowboy stories and Rex Stout mystery stories, but I also read a lot of fly fishing stories. Robert Graver at the time, and Roderick Haig Brown, and Patrick McManus, and a few others, and for whatever reasons, especially McManus, I just kind of liked his stories. It was kind of fishing outdoors, and he wrote Last Laugh, a column for Outdoor Life for many.
Yeah, and he was kind of a comic, right? He had a lot of comedy in his writing.
Yeah, light-hearted. Yeah, kind of little quirky stories, and so you kind of make you chuckle. So I kind of was interested in that, but I never thought about writing until when we moved to Montana, and my wife was into. We were both into bird watching, and she was more so because she came from a bird watching family, and she resurrected the local Audubon chapter. And I was able to, we had a newsletter, and she said, "Why don't you write something for it?" And I said, "Okay." And I wrote a monthly vignette on a local bird. And I kind of tried to make it creative, just more than just what they ate and what they looked like, and kind of give a little tale about them. And the local newspaper, which was Southwest Montana newspaper, Montana Standard, it was called, out of Butte. The editor of the magazine, or of the newspaper, called me once and said, would you be interested, because she was a birder, and she said, would you be interested in doing a weekly article about a bird? And I said, oh man, and I said, well, yeah, great opportunity, and so I did, and I draw. I was at the time I was doing a little drawing, and I draw a bird and do a kind of a 300 to 400 word vignette of with little folksy tales that I could find about particular species, and I did that for 8 years. Never got paid, but the thing was, it forced me to write every week. And at that time, my brother and I were doing the Steelhead book. And then it just sort of got me into thinking, well, heck, maybe I can start doing some of those stories that I like to read, like the McManus stories. And I had accumulated in my mind quite a few little possibilities throughout my travels. And that's what inspired coming out with At the River's Edge, which was in 2002, I believe. And the good thing about that, was when it was published, the Montana Standard, because I had done all of those over the years, and I had a bunch of followers following my bird article every week, which, a lot of them were, I'm sure, little old ladies who put, seed in their bird feeder.
Right.
And but the Standard did a full page with a colored photo of me standing next to the Big Hole River review of that book. And geez, did I sell a lot of books.
Oh, wow.
So I always say to people, if an opportunity knocks for whatever it might be, take advantage of the opportunity. You don't get paid for it. It somehow comes back to you. And I've always encouraged people to not be picky. If something comes along, take it and run with it. And I did. And that was it. It's kickstarted me into writing, which then after that, At the River's Edge, I released 3 other books. But also it just opened up a lot of other writing opportunities along the way, whether it was articles or other books, things like that. So, and then just recently, guys starting another online magazines. I don't know how many online magazines there can be, but on the other hand, he wants me to write a quarterly article. So, so the opportunities keep coming.
Yeah.
It's something you can do when you're old, like me. So that as I always say, and a lot of people will ask me, and I've done that with music when I used to teach kids. I taught school for 3 years in Salt Lake City, Utah. And we started me and another fellow started a music club. And at least 8 to 10 of those kids learned to play guitar, and several of them became professional musicians. They were not famous professional musicians, but they do Holiday Inns and things like that. So like I said, if these opportunities come along, grab hold of them, and you never know where they're going to lead. And that's even with me. I try to encourage people, if they need, especially with writing, I try to, I'll read, if someone sends me a manuscript, I'll read it, and I'll try to get them hooked up with wherever they can get hooked up with. So it's just, one of those things you can kind of just keep passing on and hopefully be beneficial to making someone else's life and come true, I guess is what I'm going to say. So.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's cool to hear that because you have all these experiences in your life and, and stories. That's what's amazing about the stories. I mean, we're doing a little bit of that, telling some of that, but it's not like a book, it's not like a book that you could sit down and, relive, put yourself in the play like you did. That's a cool thing, right? Joe Brooks, you go back to your influences. You had this person before you were writing, right? Heavily. You were learning from him, and now people are doing the same for you with your stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And, just sort of pass it on. And that interesting thing about Joe Brooks is just a little side, like a lot of I get these little stories. As I was recently last fall, I went out for a beer with Joe Brooks, his nephew.
Oh yeah, his nephew. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was able to. He was in the area. Joe Brooks is actually from this area. So
he is. Okay.
I mean, I kind of all of these different threads that kind of tie back to Joe Brooks, and I am living in northern Maryland right now. Just right down the street to 3 blocks is the Chesapeake Bay and northern Chesapeake Bay, and so I have that connection with Joe Brooks too. Last night when I was fishing the Susquehanna, Joe Brooks used to fish the Susquehanna, so it's just all of these kind of connections. Oh,
in the same area. Yeah, we did an episode with Joe Brooks, not the Joe Brooks, but episode 71. We'll put a link in the show notes with the person you're talking about. I think it was his cousin, or not his cousin, but his nephew, I believe, right?
his nephew, yeah.
Yeah, so we did a whole episode, and because he wrote the book, and then we talked. It was really interesting because it was pretty deep. Joe Brooks' life is really interesting because, I mean, at one point in his life with alcoholism, it got so bad that he was like living off the streets.
Yeah, that thing. Yeah, and fly fishing saved his life.
Yeah, and fly exactly. And so it's a really powerful story, but he told that story, and so we'll put a link to that one. But I'm kind of the same way, I mean, or at least here when you think about this, it's like Lonnie we talked about. I mean, it's tough because some of these people that paved the way for all of us and help with stories, are slowly going away. So I think I would love to talk more with somebody who could tell maybe Lonnie's story. I think that would be a kind of a cool episode to do as well.
Yeah, it would be. I wonder who would be out there that could give you a little background on that.
Do you think you need a bush plane to fish Alaska's legendary waters? Think again. FishHound Expeditions specializes in road-accessible adventures that don't skip on excitement. Picture yourself fishing for massive rainbow trout, Arctic grayling, and plenty of salmon species all within Alaska's epic road system. It's doable. I fished the road system on our first day with Adam and the crew, and it did not disappoint. The largest leopard rainbow I caught and landed was right off the road system. And we'll be driving up again this year, heading up from the lower 48 all the way up to Alaska to hit those streams again. You'll experience the breathtaking beauty of Alaska's wilderness, from mountain streams to hidden rivers, perfect for anglers of all levels. FishHound Expeditions makes it easy to explore Alaska. Why wait? Your Alaska adventure is just a drive away. Book your spot now before spaces fill up. That's fishhoundexpeditions.com. FishHound expeditions.com. Don't miss out. I'm sure there's plenty of people that knew him, probably fished with him since he's fished all over the, everywhere.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. Oh, that would be a really good story.
Yeah, definitely.
Would be some insights into his background. Yeah, I was just thinking. There's the interesting thing is there was the golden period of fly fishing that sort of ended when the bamboo rods started to fade away.
Oh, is that it? So when is that? When did the golden period end?
Oh, I would say, the golden age. I mean, I'm just throwing it out there, is that it was probably the early 70s. Things just sort of died. Fishing was sort of, in a limbo state, I would have to say. And I think Wes Jordan said something to that effect, when he passed away, that, I forget it was of that sentiment. And then, it just sort of waffled along, and, people like me kind of stumbled into it. John Girac stumbled into it. And there was, a lot of these in-betweeners, eventually, the Kathy Becks came in, and then Lonnie Wallers, and they all of them somewhat, were the link between that period of time where fly fishing faded and what I call the new or the Renaissance age, the 90s.
The river runs through it was part of that, right?
Yeah. The river runs through it, started the whole Renaissance, but the people who were connecting it were the Lonnie Wallers, and of course the Lefty was there. He was sort of a thread that strung through all of it, but there was just this, group of people that just sort of emanated before fly fishing was real famous. Just kind of hanging on and, doing this sort of esoteric pursuit with no really intention other than doing it, and then eventually the doors opened to kind of profiting off it to a certain degree. And we all did to a lot of, to that point.
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty cool to see how it worked, because we talked about that with the Great Lakes. That was really interesting too, because the whole Spey, We just had an episode this week that came out with George Cook and our In the Bucket series that we're doing. And I've heard some of that where he was talking about, yeah, it's the history, right? I mean, the spay didn't get started in the Great Lakes until that period that you talked about. You guys started writing those books, and all of a sudden, like, bam, whole thing changes. And now you go back there and it's pretty popular, right?
Oh, it is. Yeah. What's interesting, I just don't go off on another little tangent here, but
Yeah.
the neat thing about working at Winston and then at Sweetgrass is I'd always get these hot tips. And a lot of times I was able to hop on them. Well, Ken High used to be, is Dr. Slick.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Slick. Sure. Yep.
And he used to go up to British Columbia steelhead fishing a lot. And he came into the shop once in the 90s, and I got to know Dr. Slick pretty good, Ken High, over the years. And he told me that, because I would really started to really get into the steelhead fishing in the mid 80s and in Idaho and particularly. And he encouraged me to go up to British Columbia. He said it was down in the 80s, but it's coming back, and not too many people are knowing about it. So I went up in 94, I drove up and fished for 8 or 9 days. And there wasn't hardly anybody up there because fishing hadn't been good apparently. And I caught some fish. I was pretty excited.
Were you up on the Skeena?
No, I went up Bulkley.
Oh, the Bulkley, yeah.
Yeah. And found some neat runs and kind of frequented them and yeah, and had a really neat week. And even accidentally started I hooked up with another guy. I just kind of stories. Hooked up with another guy, a friend of mine, who we were up there together, and we were swinging some green butt skunks and stuff like that. And we weren't doing real well, so Dick decided, he had a Waller Waker, and he decided to just skate a fly up top, and within less than an hour he had a fish. Well, I started skating a Waller Waker up top, and I got a fish, and we never looked back. We always then continued to skate. We got way more activity up there on the surface than we did, just swinging wet flies. And you sat around the campfire and talked about why, but could go on that. But on the other hand, during that period of time, it wasn't like everybody, because there wasn't that many people, but nobody was using a spay rod. Nobody up. And by the time I'd gone up there in 2000, year 2000, I would say it was 10% spay rods. And Mike Maxwell was a guide up there he had spay rodding somewhat quirky, but I think he had some rods made for him by somebody, and he was the one guy, pushing spay rods up there. But by 2000, everybody was using spay rods. It just was sort of this spay rod revolution that just unfolded within that period of time. And again, going back to the Great Lakes, I was interested in a smaller spay rod for the Great Lakes. Talked to at the time there was this pompous guy who was the general manager at Winston, and I said, we really should come out with a spay rod for the Great Lakes. He said, why would we come out with a spay rod for fishing in a cesspool? That was
wow
word.
Wow.
Yeah. And I said, man, oh man. I said, you
That's
just
crazy.
Right. Yeah. He just sort of chuckled off. He said, what kind of business can we do there?
Jeez.
No vision whatsoever. And at the time, a friend who he's since then passed away. He was a rod designer, Sam Druckman. And Sam came up with the two B2X series, which was actually a 4-piece with boron butt. And actually, it was probably the second best series of rods Winston ever made. The first best, and still is classic, is Tom Morgan's IM6 series.
Yeah.
I call it the Coca-Cola rods. You just can't do anything better than what those rods were. But Sam came up with this interesting, I still fish with them, B2X series. And I talked to him about 11-foot rod for the Great Lakes and a two-hander and that. And the day that whatever, I don't know why that general manager left, but the day he left, Sam came to me and gave me this 11-foot rod that he'd been working on. And it was a single-handed. I still have it, and it's a single-handed 11-footer. It's just really neat, functional rod. But and then he converted it into a mini spey, and that rod sold so many rods, so pieces throughout the Great Lakes. But people on the Deschutes, every place was using the 11-foot smaller speys. That was the thing I found with spey rods, is that when in the first few years, everybody was using these 15-footers, and I was watching these people landing fish with a 15-footer. It looked like they were wenching them in. I mean,
Yeah.
they were just sort of out of touch with reality. And so eventually the rods got down into that 12 to 13-foot range, which was a lot more manageable. But these little mini speys, on a lot of the smaller rivers and the Great Lakes and even the West Coast took on. And I still, that general manager's words still echo in my head,
Yeah.
Cesspool, the great
Right.
cesspool, and now a couple $1 billion industry up the Great Lakes. So,
Oh, yeah.
and that was the other thing. I think Rick and I eventually, as I said in the earlier, we were fishing the bead heads, little Estaz eggs and glow bugs, and we were fishing the Manistee River, on one of our journeys, and we were swinging egg-sucking leeches at the time. I forget, the water was coming up, it was raining. Geez, one afternoon we hooked fish we couldn't land them because there was this big log we couldn't get around. But we hooked one fish after another. We landed a few, but and I think that was the dawning of the era of, hey, you can just swing flies on these fish just like you do on the West Coast. And we never looked back, is what the thing was.
That was it.
Yeah, it's just, it was sort of this eye opener for us. We just accidentally said, well, geez, we bought into the fact that you couldn't catch fish.
You couldn't catch fish. Yeah. And what was the reasoning behind that? Why do you think
I have no idea. I have
Yeah.
no idea. The thing, and it was even the Michigan people. But this was when we were in the initial stages, the way they used to fish. They didn't use fly lines. They just used straight mono and a little baggie, a little kind of nylon filled weight of BBs. And they'd put it, so it was this sort of like a pencil weight, but it was kind of a made up little baggie of a shot that they'd put, and then they'd extend 8-foot leader beyond that and a fly, but essentially they were dragging the bottom with these flies, and that was the way we were told. That was the only way you could catch a fish on a fly there, because or whatever.
Right, down and dirty, down to the bottom.
Yeah, and we watched them sometimes, and a lot of the fish they hooked were foul hooked on top of it. It just made no sense. And so again, we went back to, well, we're going to just nymph fish for them, and that obviously was working, but so that refuted the fact that you couldn't catch them on a fly, which they were telling us that there was just no way that would work. And then we gradually got into just accidentally, but 100% committed then to swinging the flies somewhere in the late 90s. And with that came what I always thought with the Great Lakes. I'll give Great Lakes and the people who really got into it after that a whole series of flies that were unique to the Great Lakes, and they were. My brother was right in the front end of all of that, using bunny strips. Just a lot of marabou, just a lot of flies that had a lot of action. And as compared to the West Coast, where a lot of the flies we were using out there were just real static, just green butt skunks,
Yeah, traditional wet flies, which was just a little tiny little wet fly.
Yeah, and they were just sort of static. They didn't have that much flow on them, general practitioners, and they were just, and so that was unique to the Great Lakes. But then I started using some of, my green butt skunks out west. I started tying, instead of just a wing of a white
Calf tail.
bucktail, yeah. And I'd start using bunny strips, white bunny strips, and it'd give it a
As the
lot
wing.
more, yeah, and give it a lot more life. And so I think a lot of the Great Lakes flies started showing up on the West Coast with a lot more action in them. That's sort of my interpretation. If I could see, the one unique aspect that I kind of bring into this stuff. After I started Sweetgrass, I didn't steelhead fish as much, but for 20 some years, I really fished a lot. The one thing I did do over the years was I didn't know of too many people that fished the Great Lakes and the West Coast and British Columbia, and I spent 6 weeks over in Russia, so I'm kind of a unique person because I'm not sure how many people have done all of those.
No, there's not too many people. We've talked to a lot. We've done a ton of steelhead episodes, but I don't think there's too many people that have. I mean, just that the Great Lakes to the west. I think most people haven't done that. I think that it's always all the stories of whatever, the Great Lakes steelhead not being steelhead. I think that's I think it's behind. I think it's like, hey, they're steelhead. It's just a different way to fit, a different area, a different way to fish.
Yeah. And they're just in there. The thing is, they have at least the connection to steelhead because they're genetically steelhead.
Yeah, exactly.
You want to make that point. But so I was, the only place in the the only place that I haven't caught a steelhead is Indiana.
Oh, Indiana, right. And Indiana does have a steelhead?
Yeah, but one or two steelhead streams, but I've caught them in every province and every state, and California and Oregon and Washington.
Right. Wow. So you've pretty much caught fish in every state where they live.
Yeah, except Indiana.
Except for Indiana, and then the province. You've obviously BC. You've been up there.
Yeah. So it's just sort of an interesting. I kind of have a unique perspective of a lot of this. I'm never going to be known for my steelhead prowess, but I have to say I did fish in a lot of different steelhead venues for sure.
That's awesome. Well, I think that's a perfect segue to take it out of here in our this is like our travel segment here. And today I'm just going to give a shout out. This is presented by Mountain Waters Resort. We're actually doing a trip for Atlantic salmon. So that's something it's been on my bucket list. We've talked about, but we're going to be heading out to the East Coast to Newfoundland. And the cool thing about this trip is it's Mountain Waters Resort is the same resort where Lee Wolf used to fly. It was his resort right back in the day, and he really popularized Atlantic salmon fishing up in Newfoundland out to this area. So I'm going to be fishing kind of like you did with Joe Brooks, in your area. I'm going to be fishing these places where Lee Wolf, literally at the same cabin locations and stuff. So I'm pretty excited about that. And the cool thing, your brother too, also I was going to mention, might be going on this trip with us. I've been talking to him to see if he wants to join us up there and chase these fish, because obviously he's got Atlantic salmon. But so I want to first start off with a shout out to Mountain Waters Resort on that. And then, and for you, what is obviously you've talked travel this whole episode. Was this when you look back at your 25-year-old self, or, that early ages, did you foresee, how much of this did you foresee? Did you think this is the way it was going to turn out with all the travel?
I never really even thought about, that aspect. It's just one thing unfolded to another, and then one thing led to another. And like you said, Atlantic salmon, I drove from Montana to the maritime states, maritime provinces, 9 times from Montana to Atlantic salmon fish.
So maritime provinces are those, what are those, that whole east?
Oh, so I've caught Atlantic salmon in Quebec and Newfoundland, and in Nova Scotia. I did fish the Miramichi in New Brunswick, but I didn't catch a fish there. But yeah, I just
Well, you're a good person to ask about this because you fish for summer steelhead, right? Winter steelhead are a little bit different, but you hear summer steelhead are a lot like Atlantic salmon. What is your take on Atlantic salmon versus the summer steelhead? How similar are they?
interesting. Yeah, my one summer steelhead, I guess, a couple of experiences were on Dean River. I was able to a couple times in I think July, and then fishing for Atlantics. I do a couple times in Quebec in June. And yeah, so those two would be time frames would be very comparable. I just, the interesting thing I would have to say, I always said with Atlantic salmon is they tend, I won't say delicate isn't the word, they tend to fight a lot more majestically, where steelhead fight more doggedly.
Oh, okay.
Might have to say,
Yeah.
that would be if I have to classify them. But when I think about it, yeah, those two never really did think about it, but those two would be exact comparisons.
Yeah, that's it. And so the Atlantic salmon you caught, were you catching those? What patterns were you fishing for those?
Oh, Green Highlander is one that I like the most. I probably, when I get a fly, other than changing every now and then, if it's catching fish, I don't change it a whole lot. But I like the green butt stunk out west, plus a couple of the fly, especially in the fall, flies that somewhat imitated the October caddis type of fly, and then the green butt skunk, and let's see, the black bear, green butt black bear, I think was another one I used to fish for Atlantic salmon, and the green Highlander, and I forget if there was a few other ones, some of the wakers that I used. But usually it was just kind of riffle hitched some of those patterns and stuck with those.
Gotcha. It seems like, that's always we talk about that a little bit, just the challenge of so many cool places to go, not enough time. Do you still have a few places that you'd like to get out to that you haven't been to?
Oh boy, yeah, as it turned out, I had really kind of planned on doing a lot more, and then 2020 came along, and
What would be your advice for somebody listening now, maybe is younger and thinking like, oh man, I want to do as much as possible? What would you tell them?
boy, to a certain degree, I do see the people who are doing that kind of stuff are the ones that are doing the guiding. That, that seems to be, if you're a younger guy and you're ambitious enough and all of that, it's tough. Any of these things are tough to do affordably. And so what I do notice is the ones that are doing them are the guy.
Yeah, because the guides are able to dial in their own fishery, and if they get really good, then they're known for it, and then they take their clients off and go travel on like hosted trips around the world.
And they can do other things, yeah, so they can offshoot it. So that would be the difference between nowadays and the trout bumming days. I always say that trout bumming is not as affordable these days.
Right. Yeah, trout bumming is not as easy. Well, trout bumming probably is doable in some, but yeah, like permit bumming or bonefish bumming, right? All that stuff is kind of spendy.
Yeah, you just can't up and do it. I always said that's why I went to Mexico. I just want to do stuff on my own. And as it turned out, I spent a lot of money to do that, where I felt if I would have had the opportunity to do it over again, I would use the money that I spent on that place on the beach and just gone down to Mexico for a month every year.
Yeah, right.
So there's sort of a lesson learned there, but yeah, it's tough to find a lot of do-it-yourself types of places, and that's what kind of always my driving force, to find the do-it-yourself places, and they're still out there. I mean, that's still out there. It just and now here I am to talk about where I am now. I didn't really. I'm 3 blocks away from the water here, and when I first moved here, 10 years ago, there were striped bass on all over the place.
So you're still in the Buffalo area?
No, I'm in northern Maryland.
Oh, you're in Maryland. Okay.
Yeah, just as 3 blocks away from. It's called the Northeast River, but it's a very upper edge of Chesapeake, right near the Susquehanna River. And this was and it still is a prime spawning area for stripers, but the striper population has gone down tremendously, and unfortunately, just poor management again. And I've noticed it in my fishing, where I can normally, when I used to, it's just 3 years ago and be beyond that, I'd be able to pop in my kayak and just kind of putz around all this water that's just right available to me. And during the right, and I only go out for 2 or 3 hours, and during the right tide, I'd catch 2 to 4 fish, and this is more of a rearing area, so I'm not talking about huge, just nice size. And they're just nice fly rod fish, it's like 16 to 24 inches, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller. But and last year doing the same thing, where the first few years I was catching a few hundred, just putzing around like that. Last year I caught 7.
Oh, wow.
So, it's fishing the same intensity,
Same stuff.
the same area, same water, same, and it's just really, really sad to see things going downhill. Yeah, and the thing that kind of still makes it worth going out is you never know what you're going to hook. There's tidal, like we call them tidal largemouth. The largemouth, because the tide comes up, the largemouth kind of swim with the tide, and so you're not finding them under lily pads and stuff like that. They kind of move with the tide, so you'll never know where you're going to find the largemouth. And then there's snakeheads. I just don't catch many snakeheads, but I'm always looking for them and introduce species. And then you got smallmouth, and my whole intention when I retired, and that's why I moved to Mexico, was to fish for non-trout species. I just kind of wanted to just
try some new stuff.
Yeah, new species, new techniques, new everythings, and the other part of it is I had my fun in the sun with trout and steelhead, and give other people the opportunity, and so, but all this is leading to is that I'm just fishing mediocre water. I'm not fishing elbow to elbow with anybody. There's hardly anybody fishing any of the water.
Yeah.
Fish. And it's nice to be out there and just kind of not be crowded and catch a fish now and then. And I kind of the pisser about the whole thing is I don't need 20 fish striper days. I just like to have the opportunity to catch some stripers, which have sort of been taken away from us by poor management, as boils down to a lot of technique, a lot of things that have led.
That's a bummer. Well, I think that's something we could probably keep up on. I would love to hear more. Maybe on the next one, we could chat to you more about the kind of stripers, where that's going. I would like to take it away on kind of our random segment. You mentioned the guitar. Let's just take it back there, and we'll take it out of here on your music. It sounds like that's a pretty big part. We mentioned that Spotify song you have, or the song on Spotify. What is your music? How would you describe it? Who are your influences? Is that something you do regularly?
Oh, no, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Well, I grew up during the folk rock era.
Oh, yeah. Like Bob Dylan.
Oh, yeah. So it was all, the Dylans, the Jim Croce's, the Harry Chickens, and that's kind of what I always, at one point in my life, would have loved to be one of those guys,
Right.
But traveling, I at one point what kind of fantasized being the rambling man, kind of bard driving around and singing here and singing there. I never got to that point, but I was, I played a lot of, learned, and
Have you played in front of some audiences?
I did, but and I'm just not that was the other thing. I realized I'm more of a private guy. I'm not an entertainer guy, so I never was really comfortable doing that. And but I'd some of my initial writing was just writing songs. I just write, some folk rock types of songs is what I use. And to a certain degree, I think when I'm rereading or rewriting some of the stuff that I write for my stories, I kind of have a little rhythm in the story that it's probably imperceptible to people who are reading it, but to me, it's just sort of, there's almost a song-like quality in what I write. It's just I'm almost thinking that you could put it to music, and so that was, I kind of got into like Martin guitars. So at one time I had 10 Martin guitars. It was one of the things I used to collect a little of, and I still have a couple of them. But my hands, after building so many rods, my hands are really kind of arthritic. So playing just as a lot more difficult now than it was. So it sort of faded out of my life. But there was a period of time, especially when my wife was dying, where I was spending a lot of time at home and played a lot of music and was writing at that time too. So yeah, it's been was a big influence in a lot.
It was. Music is powerful. But what is you mentioned Jimmy Buffett. Is there somebody, a tune we could leave, maybe a musician or a song that we could leave in the show notes as we take it out here?
Oh, geez, yeah. Let me.
Is Jimmy Buffett, was he one of your? Did you like his music?
Oh yeah, come Monday, it'll be all right, type of thing. That was one of the big, that was the type of music I liked, the kind of emotional kind of that grabs you. But there was one I wrote about it. It's just it's a Jimmy Buffett. Zach Brown did it.
Oh, here's one I'm just looking at. Zach Brown collaborated with Jimmy Buffett on the hit song "Knee Deep."
That's it.
Oh, awesome. We got a great song. Okay. So we'll get Knee Deep in the show notes. So right now people can, everybody listening can listen to that as we take it and I'll do the same.
Yeah, that's it.
Cool. Well, this has been great, Jerry. I think we could probably hold this one there for now. We'll send everybody out to sweetgrassrods.com, and then they could also find you on Facebook. Just searching what Jerry Kustich fly fishing probably or something like that.
Yeah, that would be. And if anybody's interested in the books, that they are on Amazon too. So
yeah, they're all on Amazon. Yeah, we'll put links to all your books as well in the show notes so they can take a look at all those and and check out some of that soul, right? I feel like the soulful writing, the soulful bamboo, the soul and the bamboo rods, right? It's all kind of a similar, and the music feels like that's kind of your thing, right?
Yeah, it all kind of all tied together. I've kind of always looked at my life to a certain degree as there was something that kind of led me along, whether it's the great spirit or whatever it was. It seemed like, something came along whenever at a time when I needed it to come along,
Yeah, it worked out. Sounds like it worked out to me. It sounds like you've had a pretty amazing journey along the way. So we'll send everybody out there, and then Jerry, this has been great. We'll just until we talk to you again on the next one, we'll look forward to us following you and then keeping in touch.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Dave. This was great to talk. I like to say, I like to talk. And when when we used to have that shop, and when I worked, that's what we did. People come in, and I was able to work and talk at the same time.
Yeah,
so
you got the best.
Yeah, so it worked out nice, and that's kind of what I miss. That's if I miss anything in my life now, it's the fact that I don't have that kind of intermingling with angler like I used to. Which I used to really, really like.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's what's cool about the podcast is it allows me to do the same thing.
Yeah, it does. It's at least kind of is that connection.
Yeah, it's not totally in person, which is always the best, but it's the second to that. But cool, Jerry. All right, well, we'll be in touch. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, Dave.
If you get a chance to check in with Jerry today, you can do that. Go on Facebook, track him down. We'll have a link in the show notes. Also, if you want to go to Sweetgrass Fly Rods, you can go check them out right now, see their amazing work. and do that if you get a chance. If you haven't yet, subscribe to this podcast. You can follow the show on your podcast of app. And want to give one shout out before we get out of here. We are heading to the Missouri, the Big Mo this year with On the Mark Lodge. If you're interested in that, send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com, or you can go to wetflyswing.com/Missouri, and we'll follow up with you on availability there. Hope to see you and talk to you there. Thanks again for checking out the show today. Hope you have a great morning. Hope you have a great afternoon or a fantastic evening if it's evening, and we'll talk to you on that next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.